Welcome back to Tales of Knights and Magic. Subscribe if you like, and now get comfortable, and enjoy this glimpse into the world of fantasy. The moon rode high over the crooked rooftops of Falshore, its silvery light falling in fractured patterns through the narrow alleys and onto the damp cobblestones. Darren moved like a shadow, slipping between shuttered windows and abandoned stalls. His cloak, threadbare and stained, fluttered behind him as he darted toward the tavern's back door, the rune in his left eye flickering with a pale blue glow that lent him sight far beyond mortal ken. He paused for a moment in a narrow passage, listening. From somewhere ahead came the muffled shouts of patrons and the scrape of tankards against wood. Good business as usual, perfect for slipping inside unnoticed. When he reached the tavern door, he gave it a light push. It groaned on ancient hinges, revealing a cluttered storeroom, lined with barrels of old wine, sacks of grain, and a rickety table piled with odds and ends. Darren slipped inside, closing the door so quietly that no one in the taproom could suspect his presence. His eyes, normally a dull gray, flickered with that strange rune-shaped light. He squinted at the far end of the room, where half hidden by shadow sat a battered chalice, a roughly formed cup of tarnished silver, its bowl engraved with the same dragon runes that shimmered around his eye. He'd heard rumors, stray whispers in the back lanes of the smuggler's quarter of a rune cup, a dragon's chalice, said to hold a fragment of draconic soul. Many scoffed, but Darren's rune had awakened weeks ago, and every glance into a mirror revealed its pattern subtly changing, as though alive. He crossed to the table, mind sharp and senses alert. Mercenaries prowled the streets these nights, hired by some wealthy stranger, or perhaps by the clandestine cult of the Ninth Flame, and he wasn't about to be caught empty-handed. The chalice would fetch far more coin than a pickpocket could hope to steal in a month. Darren reached out, hand trembling slightly. The metal was cool beneath his fingertips, but he sensed its hidden warmth. A heartbeat of power buried deep in the cup's core. As his fingers wrapped around the stem, the rune in his eye pulsed, dragging him into a vision that flared like a lightning bolt behind his eyelids. He saw a mountain's peak clawing at storm clouds, scales rippling across a colossal hide, and a great dragon coiled around a crystalline cavern, its eyes glowing with ancient hunger. Then the scene shattered, and Darren staggered, ripping his hand free as though burnt. "Easy there," a voice called from beyond the door. "Who's in?" Darren jammed his shoulder against the table, sending sacks and barrels cascading to the floor. The tavern's back door burst open, and two rough-hewn mercenaries stumbled in, swords drawn, eyes already fixed on the fallen chalice. No time for stealth now. He snatched up a length of rope from a hook, and swung it, looping it around one guard's ankles. The man went down with a curse. Darren darted past the second guard, rammed the chalice into his gut, then darkly wondered why he still felt the faint throb of power echoing through his bones. He swiped a dagger from his belt, ducked beneath a clumsy swing of the merch's sword, and drove the blade home into the man's thigh. The guard howled, dropped his blade and collapsed. The world steadied around Darren as he retrieved the chalice and backed toward the door, eyes still aflame with that alien glow. He slipped out into the alley, weaving through a forest of twisted beams and piles of refuse, until finally he reached the open street. The tavern's door flapped behind him, and he caught the clang of armor as more guards rushed out in pursuit. He turned a corner and broke into a run, feet pounding the uneven stones. By the time he reached the old docks, the rune in his eye had dimmed to a soft pulse. He paused at the canal's edge and drew a long, shuddering breath. The chalice was heavy in his satchel, wrapped in an oilcloth to keep its power hidden. Beneath the dock, a rusted ladder led down into the water. He climbed it and disappeared beneath the planks, just as torches lit up the street above. When he surfaced, the moonlight caught on the ripples of the canal, shimmering like 1,000 tiny stars. Darren kicked off the ladder, swam a short distance to a weathered wooden skiff, and hauled himself aboard. He cut the mooring line with his dagger and slid a lone oar into its lock. The little boat rocked as he pushed away from the dock, leaving the tavern and those mercenaries behind. The runaways of Falshore were legion, but few carried the kind of prize Darren now held. He pressed a calloused hand to his left eye and let the rune's glow whisper to him, feeling its pulse slow as the water drifted beneath the boat. He closed his eyes and tried to focus, to hear the chalice's song, but only darkness answered. He drifted until dawn, when the mists off the canal lifted and revealed the old canal gates of Eastworth. Beyond lay the river terrace, and with it, freedom. A week ago, Darren might have sold the chalice immediately to any merchant bold enough to handle such a thing. But since the rune had appeared, transforming his sight into the gift or curse of draconic vision, he'd realized that this was bigger than a quick score. In the light of morning, he hauled the skiff onto a muddy ramp and dragged it behind a stack of crates. The warehouse yard was deserted, but he kept his hand on the dagger at his hip. He'd heard tales of the cultists of the Ninth Flame, cloaked supplicants who whispered to ancient beasts in hidden temples. They craved dragon magic. If they learned of the Chalice's appearance and the rune in Darren's eye, they'd stop at nothing to seize them both. He crouched beside the crates and shook the oilcloth from the chalice. The silver gleamed, still etched with those wicked runes that seemed to shift like ink and water. Carefully, Darren lifted it and set it on the wooden planks at his feet. He stared into its depths, and found himself looking back into his own eye. Only there the rune burned brighter, throbbing gently, as if the cup recognized its other half. He reached for it, but then heard footsteps, heavy boots on stone. He ducked back, slumping behind the crates. 3 figures approached, a tall man in a leather jerkin, a wiry woman with a crossbow slung across her shoulder, and a short hooded figure whose face was hidden in shadow. Eyes peeled, the tall man whispered, "The boss said the item's here somewhere, no mistakes." Darren held his breath. This was worse, a small gang of hired blades rather than the cultists. They might kill for gold, but they had no respect for ancient magic. If they found the chalice, they'd treat like any other trinket, and whose coin would wind up behind it? God knew. One step closer, Darren gripped his dagger, heart hammering. The hooded figure bent to pick something from the planks. Could it be? They were here. Found it, the woman hissed. What's so special about a cup, anyway? As dull as it sounded, the name Chalice of the Ninth Flame sent a jolt through Darren's spine. He surged from the crates, blade raised, and ended up face to hood. The dagger bit into flesh. The hooded figure stumbled back with a strangled cry. Behind him the tall man swung a mace and blood spurted across the wooden planks. In the chaos, Darren spun and kicked the woman's crossbow out of her hands, knocking her backward. The third guard recovered his blade and lunged at Darren's chest, but the green rune in his eye lit up like a beacon, and in that instant he saw the movement in slow motion. The angle of the guard's sword, the shifting weight, and the path his dagger needed to take. It slid between armor plates and the guard crumpled. The tall man roared and came after him. Darren dodged aside, but the man's mace caught him in the shoulder. Pain bloomed, hot and sharp. Darren stumbled. The chalice clattered on the ground. He looked at it and the rune in his eye flared, brighter than the moon overhead, coursing through his nerves like wildfire. Time snapped open. For a heartbeat, Darren felt eagle-sharp, every sense heightened to unbearable focus. He saw the tiniest imperfections in the wood grain beneath his feet, the hesitant quiver of the tall man's hand as he prepared another blow. With the chalice's power burning through him, Darren seized the moment. He kicked out, sending the man sprawling, then scooped up the cup and darted toward the riverbank. Behind him came the screech of curse. He slipped into the skiff just as the tall man reached the water's edge and raised the mace. Darren shoved off, but the mace arced down and cracked the boat's gunwale. Wood splintered. The skiff lurched. Water rushed in. Heaving curses of his own, Darren shoved the oar into the lock and began rowing weakly. The skiff sputtered like a wounded beast. With each stroke, the cup in his lap weighed heavier, as though it sought to bind itself to his soul. When the canal gates slid open, Darren pushed through, and finally the current claimed him. The morning sun glinted on the river's surface, and he let the chalice rest in his lap as he drifted toward open water. His shoulder throbbed, his cloak was soaked with sweat, and his mind burned with question. What was the chalice's purpose? How could its magic be so volatile, and why had it chosen him? He remembered the vision when he first touched it. The cavern, the coiled dragon, the storm-shrouded peak, and through it all, the words echoing in a voice both ancient and distant. Bearer, unite the shards, or let the fire consume. Shards. Were there more fragments of draconic soul? If so, how many? And where were they hidden? The chalice in his hands was battered, incomplete. The runes were chipped in places, as though something had torn at them. Its power felt raw and unrefined, like a beast half awakened. He slid the chalice into his satchel and leaned back against the boat's stern, closing his eye. The river's current lulled him, and the rune in his eye faded to a steady pulse. He pictured a map, mountain passes crowned with snow, forests choked with mist, ancient ruins whispered of and half-forgotten legends. Somewhere in those places lay the next fragment, but other forces sought the chalice, and now they knew it was more than a trinket. Cultists of the Ninth Flame would come, those who worship dragons as avatars of destruction, and the city's petty tyrants would seek to control its might for their own gain. Darren would have to stay one step ahead, always moving, always watching. When he finally disembarked at the ruined weir outside East Wharf, the sun was high. He trudged up the muddy bank, shoulders aching, and surveyed the ruined archway of stone, the old boundary marker between Falshore and the wildlands beyond. From here, no patrols dared venture. The road turned to a rocky trail that wound through the Shadow Grove, then climbed toward the spine of dragons. He adjusted the straps of his satchel and set off at a brisk pace, heart pounding with equal measures of fear and excitement. The rune in his eye pulsed with each step, like a second heartbeat. He did not know what lay ahead, but he did know that the world he had lived in, of back-alley thievery and petty scams, was gone. He held in his hand the embers of a dragon's soul, a power ancient and terrible, and it had claimed him. The road ahead was dark and winding, filled with dangers both mortal and magical. But with every beat of his heart, every breath drawn in anticipation of what lay beyond, Darren felt something stir within him. Courage or perhaps madness. Either way, he was bound to the Chalice, and he would see this quest through to its end. Whatever that might bring. He cast one last glance at the river behind him, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun, and then turned to face the trail that climbed into the unknown. The Chalice nestled against his side, its runes whispering, its power sleeping for now. And with that, Darren stepped forward into the wilds, determined to unravel the riddles of dragon magic, one shattered shard at a time. Darren's boots crunched over frost-tipped stones as the trail wound upward into the Shadow Grove, the rune in his eye pulsing faintly with each footfall. The air smelled of damp moss and rotting wood, and branches overhead wove together so thickly that even midday light came dark and green. He kept his hand on the hilt of his dagger, satchel secured at his hip, heart tight with the thrill of the unknown. Every so often the rune tugged at his vision, teasing him with visions of cavern walls and draconic scales, but whenever he reached for those echoes they slipped away like smoke. Further up the path he came upon a broken obelisk, half buried in brambles, its surface scarred by runes identical to those on the Chalice. He crouched to trace a finger over one deep groove, feeling a hum through his fingertips. The symbol matched the shifting pattern in his eye exact. She hesitated only a moment before setting the Chalice beside the obelisk, and lifting it to catch the light filtering through the canopy. A ribbon of mist curled around the cup's rim, and for a heartbeat, Darren thought he heard low guttural breathing. Then the wind gusted, snapping leaves above, and the hush returned. He picked up the Chalice and moved on, uneasy now as though the forest itself watched him. Shadow Grove was famed for wraiths and worse souls trapped between worlds, when dragons first warred with men, but Darren did not believe in ghosts. Myth was for scholars like Maros. Still, sweat beaded on his brow. He turned over one question again and again. Why had the Chalice chosen it? At a bend in the trail he glimpsed movement ahead. A figure crouched beside a shallow spring, cupping water in dirty palms. Darren slowed, blade ready, until the figure rose, revealing a lean face framed by greasy black hair and a beard flecked with ash. The man's eyes flicked to the rune cup at Darren's side, widening. "You have that," the stranger said, voice low and urgent. "I've chased whispers of it for months." Darren gripped his dagger tighter. "Who are you?" "Name's Ren. I once served Barnard the Unbowed before he fell to madness hunting dragons. Then I heard you took the Chalice from Falshore." Rennick's gaze darted around the grove as though expecting cultists to spill from the underbrush. "We share a goal. I know of a ruin where the next shard lies buried, but I can't reach it alone." Darren weighed Rennick's words. He'd trusted Maros once, only to find the scholar more interested in notes than loyalty. Rennick smelled of desperation and old blood. Maybe a deserter from some vicious mercenary company. Still, the offer of guidance through Shadow Grove was tempting. One wrong turn could lead to a trap. "All right," he said finally, "but no tricks." Rennick nodded, easing a short sword free from his belt. "No trick." They set off side by side, Rennick leading through a maze of gnarled roots and slime-slick stones. The forest closed in around them, branches scraping at their cloaks like skeletal fingers. The rune in Darren's eye throbbed as they passed ancient standing stones carved with draconic motif. Hours later they reached the hollowed maw of an earth-sunk temple, its entrance half-caved and moss-ridden. Above the lintel, two dragons faced each other in bas relief, mouths open in silent roar. "Here," Rennick whispered. "The lore speaks of a chamber beneath the altar where a fragment was sealed by priests, fearing the dragon's return." Darren tightened his grip on the Chalice, and followed Rennick inside, torch alight in his free hand. The air smelled of mildew and old incense. Every footstep echoed eerily off stone walls thick with webs. At the far end a dais held a cracked altar, and in its center lay a shallow depression shaped like a dragon's scale. Darren lifted the Chalice to the imprint. Runic lines on the rim glowed softly, and the Chalice vibrated as though yearning to be set down. Rennick gripped Darren's shoulder. "Be careful." Darren nodded and placed the Chalice into the scale-shaped hollow. Instantly the hall shook, stones rattling loose from overhead. A shaft of moonlight pierced the temple roof, striking the chalice and setting the rune to flame in Darren's eye. Pale blue fire raced along the chalice's surface and cracked open a hidden compartment at its base. From within rolled a small obsidian shard flecked with red. As Darren reached for the shard, a guttural growl shook the chamber. From the darkness beyond the altar emerged a hulking shape, a drake no larger than a mastiff, but twisted by centuries underground, its scales jagged and dull, eyes glowing embers. It hissed, low and savage, claws scraping stone. Rennick raised his sword, face pale. Darren's hand stilled on the shard. The drake's gaze locked on the chalice's glow, nostrils flaring. The beast lunged, and Rennick met it with steel, sparks flying as claws met sword. Darren retreated, torn between aiding Rennick or seizing the shard, and fleeing. The rune in his eye burned with urgency. At that moment he understood the chalice bonded with draconic power only when its shards were reunited. If he took the obsidian shard now, the chalice's magic would surge, perhaps enough to drive the drake off. He hefted the chalice and tossed it toward Rennick. "Catch it!" he shouted. The scholar-turned-soldier snatched the cup mid-air, eyes wide. Darren lunged for the shard and pried it free. A shockwave rippled through the chamber as shard and chalice hummed together. The drake recoiled, scales shimmering as pale flame coursed along its spine. It snarled and backed toward the altar wall, then turned and fled into the black corridor from which it had come. Silence fell heavy as dust settled. Rennick lowered the chalice, hands shaking. Darren held the obsidian shard, pulse racing. He met Rennick's gaze. "We've got to," he said, voice steady, despite the adrenaline. "Whoever hunts us will have to deal with this." Rennick nodded, expression torn between relief and awe. Together they sealed the compartment in the chalice and lit their torches again. With 2 shards bound, Darren felt the rune in his eye thrum like a second heartbeat, each pulse echoing on stone wall. He realized the journey would grow harder, dangers multiplying as cultists and mercenaries raced to claim the growing power. But for the first time he felt something stronger than fear, purpose. They exited the temple into a sky bruised with twilight. Darren sheathed his dagger and lifted the chalice, its runes glowing softly in the dying light. "Next we head north," he said, voice low, "to the ruins of Black Spire. There's where the lore says the third piece lies buried, deep beneath the ash field." Rennick squared his shoulders and nodded. As night closed around them, Darren led the way out of the shadow grove, every sense alert to the whispering of trees and the flicker of shadows. The road ahead was long, the shards few, and the world ripe with dangers old as dragons themselves. Yet as he looked down at the chalice, humming in his satchel, he knew this was only the beginning, and that his name would soon be whispered in every crooked alley and prayer smoke temple alike. Darren led Rennick north through dank marshes, where the air hung thick with sulfur and the ground gurgled beneath their boots, the chalice secured in his satchel, and its runes pulsing like a heartbeat against his ribs. He kept to the moss-choked causeway that wound through the poisoned wetlands, Rennick matching his stride in silence. Each man lost in his own thoughts. Around them the sky brooded, low clouds stained red by distant volcanoes that crowned the spine of dragons. Occasional embers drifted down like wounded fireflies. The nearer they neared Black Spire's ash fields, the more the world felt empty of life. Charred trees stood in silent rows, their twisted limbs pointing skyward like skeletal hands begging mercy. At daybreak they reached the fringe of the ash fields, a desolate plain where the ground was covered in a thick layer of gray ash that shifted in ripples with every footfall. Darren paused to catch his breath, knelt and touched the ash with gloved finger. It clung like wet sand, bitter on the tongue when he tasted a few granules. He looked up at Rennick. "This is it. Black Spire stands beyond that ridge." He pointed to a serrated hill rising stark against the blood-red sky. A fortress sat atop it, besieged by smoke and looming spires that twisted like broken fangs. "The third shard lies somewhere beneath those ruins." Rennick nodded, glancing warily at the lifeless horizon. "Ashfields sap the spirit of even the hardiest soldier. We'll need to move fast. Haunting winds here carry more than dust. They say the cries of the mad cling to the ash and lure travelers astray." Darren grimly accepted the warning. He adjusted his cloak to cover the rune-etched chalice strapped inside his satchel, then started across the field. Rennick followed, stepping in his companion's footprints to ease the passage. For hours they trudged, the ashen wind clawing at their faces, each breath drawing grit into their lungs. The rune in Darren's eye throbbed with each passing mile, as though sensing the proximity of the next shard. He closed his good eye and focused on the shifting patterns in his left, willing the rune to guide him. At times he thought he heard distant laughter, whispers on the wind, "Bearer, come," but when he glanced over his shoulder, Rennick's face remained set and grim. No hint of illusion in his gaze. Late in the afternoon, they reached a narrow defile in the ash dunes, a stone strait that funneled wind into howling gusts. Darren shielded his eye from a blast of fiery ash and stumbled backward, but Rennick caught him by the arm. "Easy now," he said. "We're close to the outer wall. That narrow pass should take us up behind the fortress." Darren nodded and pressed on, his boots sliding over the ash until he reached weather-scarred stones engraved with ancient warnings and a tongue-long death. The runes matched those on his chalice, though they were worn to near illegibility. He ran a finger across one curved line, and the rune in his eye pulsed as though in greeting. Beyond the pass lay the fortress's outer bailey, half-collapsed walls piled in scattered heaps. Towers sagged crookedly, their arrow slits empty sockets like gazing eyes. Darren crouched behind a fallen battlement and peered through a crack. Below, a squad of cultists in black hoods gathered around a smoldering brazier, chanting in low, raspy voices. Their arms bore tattoos of coiling dragons, and their leader held aloft a fragment of red glass that glowed with embers from within. Darren stiffened. This was no mere shard. It pulsed with raw power. The third piece they sought. Rennick leaned in beside him. "They've found one of the fragments already. If they unite too, they'll summon something that could blacken the skies themselves." Darren clenched his teeth. The cultists must have unearthed a separate shard somewhere west of Falshar. That meant a race to claim the fragment before they could bind it to the chalice. Darren's rune flared hot in his eye, impatience and fear colliding in his chest. He drew his dagger. "We go now." Rennick shook his head. "Too many. We need to thin their numbers or slip past unnoticed." He pointed to a narrow ledge curling around the fortress's west wall, half hidden by ash-stained ivy. "That way we can get inside the ruins and find the chamber where the fragment rests. But we need a distraction." Darren nodded and drew a coil of rope from his belt. He tied a small pouch of ash and charcoal to one end. "We'll toss this among the cultists. When they scramble, we slip past." Rennick helped Darren climb over the battlement, and they crept to the edge of the ledge. Darren thumbed the pouch's clasp and whispered a word. The pouch hissed as a spark ignited. Then he flung it over the wall. It sailed in a curving arc and landed amid the chanting cultists. Gray smoke billowed upward and the brazier's embers flared as the pouch's contents ignited. Screams broke out as the ash fire burned, and cultists staggered back, their robes catching alight in places. Guards sounded the alarm. Darren seized the moment. He and Rennick slipped through the opening in the wall where the cultists had been standing moments before. Beyond lay a ruined courtyard spattered with overturned stone benches and collapsed pillars. They crouched behind a derelict fountain, ivy choking its maw. Darren peered into the dark entrance of a corridor leading deeper into the fortress. Flickering torches cast serpentine shadows on the wall. He motioned to Rennick and they crept inside. The corridor descended via a broken staircase into the bowels of the fortress, the air growing hot and dry. Walls here were carved with draconic motifs. A coiling serpent, a fang-toothed maw, a dragon's wings spread wide. The rune in Darren's eye pulsed stronger with each symbol, guiding him as if the very stone spoke to him. They passed through a pair of heavy iron doors, one rusted shut, and found themselves in a circular hall lit by braziers that dripped molten bronze onto the flagstone. In the center stood a stone pedestal shaped like a dragon's claw, its talons curled as though about to crush whatever rested within. Darren stepped forward, heart hammering. The pedestal was empty, but he could feel the shards hum throbbing beneath the floor. He crouched and pressed his ear to the flagstone. A faint vibration answered. He rose and turned to Rennick. "It's beneath this claw. We'll need to lift the pedestal or open a hatch." Rennick nodded and they set to work, prying loose heavy slabs with crowbars. Rennick carried. Stone slabs shifted and groaned, then came free, revealing a narrow spiral shaft plunging into darkness. A fetid draft rose upward, carrying a scent of brimstone. Darren drew his torch and dropped it into the shaft. The flame guttered several times before catching, then fell out of sight, illuminating rough steps carved directly into the rock. Rennick cupped his hands over his mouth and nose, then dropped his torch and followed. Darren wrapped cloth around his face and descended after him, each step echoing into the gloom. They reached the bottom where an underground chamber opened out, its walls slick with moisture and inlaid with veins of black crystal that glinted like broken mirror. In the chamber's center sat a stone basin carved in the likeness of a dragon's eye, its pupil a void of shadow. Resting in that pupil was a fragment of red obsidian no larger than a fist, its surface etched with draconic runes that throbbed with an inner glow. Darren felt the rune in his eye flare, and his breath caught. This was the shard. He stepped forward, careful, but Rennick gripped his arm. "Wait," he whispered, "there's more here." Rennick pointed to the walls where cracks spidered across the rock and the black crystals pulsed in rhythmic patterns. The entire chamber is a ward. Removing the shard may collapse it. Darren crouched to examine the crystalline vein. He traced one with a fingertip. It hummed under his touch. He pulled a dagger and scored a shallow line along the crystal. Sparks flickered, but the crystal remained. He looked at Rennick, who was scanning the walls for traps. If we remove the shard, every piece of that ward collapses. We either break the ward carefully or find a mechanism to transfer the ward's power elsewhere. Rennick frowned. The legends say these halls were built by dragon priests to guard the power they feared. They filled the veins with corrupted fire so no mortal could claim it. We need to be precise. Darren nodded. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the chalice, its runes glowing with anticipation. The chalice can anchor draconic magic. If I set it beneath the shard, it may draw the shard's power and preserve the ward. Rennick studied him. It's risky. If the chalice rejects it, the chamber will explode. Darren's eyes glinted with resolve. It's our best chance. Hand me the chalice. Rennick passed him the cup. Darren knelt before the basin and set the chalice in the center of the dragon eye pedestal. He then removed the shard and held it over the chalice's bowl. The rune in his eye burned bright as he lowered the fragment. The shard clicked into place in a hidden recess within the chalice's base. Light flared as rune fire leapt from the chalice to the chamber's walls, weaving through the black crystals and relieving the ward of its unstable charge. The humming deepened to a sonorous tone, then subsided into a steady thrum. For a moment, everything was still. Darren exhaled and closed his eyes. When he opened them, the rune in his eye pulsed in time with the chalice's beat. Rennick grinned. You did it. Darren lifted the chalice, now heavier with 2 obsidian shards and 1 silver fragment embedded within. 3, he murmured. We've got 3. They ascended the spiral shaft as the fortress trembled. Above, the ash fields roared with the fury of disturbed spirits and the outer walls groaned under unseen weight. When they burst through the heavy iron doors into the courtyard, pillars were toppling, and the sky above Blackspire cracked with streaks of purple lightning. Cultists and guards alike fled in panic from the distorted magic shaking the foundations. Darren shouldered Rennick aside and pushed through a gap in the crumbling wall. They ran across the courtyard, past burning corpses of cultists whose flesh had been singed by unleashed arcane energy. They reached the outer defile as the fortress above them gave a final quake and a section of battlements collapsed inward. Chunks of stone rained down on the ash plain, sending up great plumes of dust. Darren and Rennick dove to either side, then scrambled to their feet and sprinted across the field toward the rolling mists. Only when the silhouette of Blackspire shrank behind them did they slow, collapsed in the lee of a ridge. Darren removed the chalice and held it out in the palm of his hand. The runes on its surface writhed and glowed in shifting colors: silver fire, ash-gray smoke, and ember red. 3 shards nestled in its base, like teeth in a maw. He watched them pulse, each beat echoing like thunder in his veins. We're beyond halfway, he said softly, but whoever lit those cultists on fire, they have 2 shards now. Rennick spat ash from his mouth. They won't rest. They'll hunt us harder than before. Darren slipped the chalice back into his satchel and looked northward at the horizon where jagged mountains rose through the smoke. The next fragment lies in the ruins of Storm Peak, ancient seat of the Skyborn clan. Legend says they shattered the dragon's heart there to end the war between worm and warrior. If we can claim that shard, we'll have 4, and the chalice will hold its full power. Rennick pushed himself to his feet, wiping sweat and ash from his brow. Then we strike before the cultists can regroup. But we'll need allies. No single mercenary or scholar can take on a dragon's wrath alone. Darren nodded gravely, mind already racing through possibilities. The mercenary captain he owed a favor, the exiled sky mage rumored to dwell in the storms above Storm Peak, even the outlaw band that roamed the lowlands south of Foulshore. He set off across the ash plain, Rennick at his shoulder, each footstep a promise of the battles and betrayals to come. Behind them, Blackspire crumbled, its spires tumbling into the fields of ash. But ahead of them lay an even greater storm, one born not of wind or fire but of draconic power rekindled by mortal hands. Darren tightened his grip on the dagger at his belt, felt the runes pulse steady in his eye, and whispered, "Onward." With that, he plunged into the dying light, resolved to gather the final shards and master the chalice's flame, or die trying. Darren and Rennick pressed onward from the ash-choked plains, leaving behind the scorched bones of Blackspire and the echoes of its collapse. The wind off the mountains bit through their cloaks as they descended toward the lowland roads, their silhouettes hunched against the gathering storm. Every step carried the weight of 3 shards and the promise of power that none could foresee. Rennick's sword hung heavy at his side. Darren's dagger burned with anticipation beneath his gauntlet. Neither spoke for miles, each man lost in thought. Darren mulling over their next move. Rennick haunted by the memories of his former captain's madness. By the time they reached the caravan road, spattered with rain and mud, both were limping from bruised shoulders and sprained ankles, but neither flinched at the pain. They grasped the chalice between them, its runes glimmering with the combined magic of silver, obsidian and red glass. As dusk fell, they arrived at the ramshackle port of Grey Harbor, a jumble of half-rotted piers, grimy warehouses and bobbing fishing boats. Lanterns swayed from creaking masts, and the stench of fish oil and seaweed clung to the air. Darren paused at a tavern doorway, surveying the crowd of weather-worn sailors and broken rogues. He sought out Captain Ivar Hawksong, a legendary smuggler who owed him a favor for an old debt. Inside the tavern's smoky gloom, he found Ivar lounging by the bar, a black patch over one eye, and a tankard of rum in hand. Ivar's grin flickered when he saw the rune crawling beneath Darren's lid. "You risk your life too freely, boy," he rasped, but his tone held warm. Darren offered a curt nod and slid a small pouch across the table, enough gold to set 2 lives up for a year. "We need safe passage up the river to Storm Peak's base," he said, voice low. Ivar chuckled, draining his tankard. "You've enough coin to charter a fleet," he growled, "but I suppose you still fancy my ship." Tomorrow at first light, the Swift Shadow sails. Before dawn, Darren and Rennick found themselves aboard the Swift Shadow, a sleek schooner painted slate gray, its sails patched but strong. Ivar's crew of 6 was a motley but loyal bunch. Bex, a sharp-tongued hull swabber, Merrick, an ex-Navy helmsman, and 4 other sea-scarred hands who eyed the Chalice with a mix of fear and awe. As the Swift Shadow cut through the mist on the Terrace River, Darren felt the rune in his eye pulse with relief at leaving the open ash fields. He sat on the gunwale, drawing the chalice from his satchel, studying its runes as they reflected the rippling water. Rennick joined him, leaning against the railing, and for a moment they shared silence. Then Rennick spoke. "The Sky Mages of Storm Peak will not surrender their shard lightly. I've heard legends of their storms, magic that makes the air itself lethal." Darren lifted an eyebrow. "Then we'll make ourselves indispensable. We persuade them we seek balance, not conquest." Rennick nodded, but his grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. The terrace broadened as they sailed north, its banks winding through emerald forests and farmland that seemed worlds away from the dead ash plain. At midday, a black cloud gathered over Storm Peak's jagged summit, dark as spilled ink. Thunder rumbled, and Ivar ordered the crew to reef the sail. Rain lashed the deck as they approached a small landing nestled at the mountain's base. The crew lowered the longboat, and Darren and Rennick climbed down, the chalice secured beneath Darren's coat. Ivar waved them off with a crooked grin. "Good luck, boy. Don't die up there. I'd miss the coin if you do." Darren flashed a grin in return and climbed into the skiff, leaving behind the safety of steel and sail. The climb to Storm Peak's lower slopes was brutal. Slick stone steps cut into the rock, each footfall sending spray of icy water across their boots. The runes in Darren's eye glowed brighter with every vertical foot, as if the chalice's call thrummed in his veins. They passed frozen streams that winked like broken glass, and fields of snow so white they hurt to look upon. Gale winds drove them against the mountainside, rattling their teeth and clawing at their skin. Rennick led the way with a rope tethered to Darren's belt, both of them straining against the gale. At one point, Darren nearly lost his footing on a narrow ledge, and felt the chalice's magic surge, steadying him as though an invisible hand gripped his shoulder. He caught his breath, heart hammering, and glanced at Rennick, who only nodded, eyes fierce with determination. 3 days after leaving Grey Harbor, they reached the summit plateau, where a solitary tower of white stone rose against the storm-scarred sky. Lightning cracked across the clouds overhead, illuminating the tower's fluted columns and swirling glyphs carved by generations of sky mages. The tower's door was a single slab of ivory marble, sealed shut save for a small crescent-shaped keyhole at its center. Darren's eye rune pulsed, and he traced the keyhole with his fingertip. "Here," he said softly. "The chalice's power reacts with the lock." He withdrew the chalice and pressed its rim against the keyhole. Runes glowed as metal met marble, then the entire door shuddered and slid inward on hidden tracks with a resonant groan. Rennick stepped back, sword ready, as Darren tied a length of rope to the chalice's stem and eased it inside. The tower's interior was circular, walls lined with bookshelves carved into niches and brimming with tomes bound in storm-tanned hide. A spiral staircase climbed to a lantern chamber above, but at the base stood a robed figure with hair like spun silver and eyes that crackled with pale light. The sky mage was tall and willowy, her horns curling behind her ears like bronze filigree. She wore a cloak that billowed though the air was still, and lightning motifs danced across her sleeves. "Bearer of the chalice," she intoned, voice resonant as thunder. I am Lyria's Stormweaver. Why do you disturb my sanctum? Darren bowed his head respectfully. I seek the shard of Stormpeak to bind it to the dragon's chalice and prevent its power from fueling the cultists of the ninth flame. His words hung in the charged air. Lyria's gaze flicked to the chalice which glimmered in the lantern light, then back to Darren. Many have come seeking that shard for conquest, she said. Why should I believe your cause is true? Darren met her gaze steadily. Because I offer you proof. I will use the shard not to dominate, but to preserve the balance of magic in our world. Bind the shard to the chalice with me here. Resist the joining, and test my resolve. If I falter, you may destroy the chalice and the shards within. Lyria regarded him in silence, violet eyes narrowed. Rennick shifted behind Darren, but said nothing. After a long moment, Lyria raised a hand and summoned a swirling storm of wind and arcane light that traced around the chamber's walls. Very well, she said. Complete your task, and I will judge your heart. Darren nodded, and drew the chalice from his satchel. He set it on a carved pedestal shaped like a dragon's wing, and then knelt before the tower's floor glyphs, concentric circles etched with sky runic symbols. A small trapdoor at the center of the glyph opened soundlessly, revealing a fragment of pale crystal the color of storm clouds. Lyria's voice whispered a counterspell, and the air stilled as Darren reached in and lifted the shard. The moment he touched it, the rune in his eye flared with white light, and the shard's cloudy surface pulsed like compressed thunder. Darren raised it over the chalice. Lyria's storm runic glyphs along the walls glowed in response. He lowered the shard into the chalice's bowl, and the tower shook as wind howled through unseen vents and lightning arced along the rune-etched wall. When the light subsided, the chalice held 4 fragments: silver, red glass, obsidian, and storm crystal, each etched with its own draconic rune. The runes on the chalice's rim writhed together, weaving a tapestry of gleaming lines that coalesced into a single dragon-shaped glyph. Lyria stepped forward, eyes alight. It is done, she whispered. The chalice is whole. She laid a hand on Darren's shoulder. You have proven your intent, but know this, the chalice's power is boundless once complete. Should you ever succumb to temptation, I will come for you. Darren inclined his head in solemn agreement. Rennick exhaled in relief, sheathing his sword. Lyria guided them to the tower's highest balcony, where the storm raged unfettered. Lightning danced across swirling clouds, and the wind roared like a living creature. From her belt she drew a feather that crackled with static. Take this, she said, handing it to Darren. When you need to call upon the storm's fury, crush it in your hand. But use it sparingly, its power will burn you if you wield it lightly. Darren accepted the feather with gratitude and stowed it safely in his satchel beside the chalice. Below them, the world stretched out in rolling hills, forests, and distant ash clouds rising above the plains. As they prepared to depart, Rennick scanned the horizon. The cultists will have felt the release of mystical energy from the tower. They may seek to seize the chalice here. Lyria nodded gravely. They will come. I can delay them, but not for long. You must move quickly. Darren wrapped the chalice in oilcloth and secured it to his belt. Where next? He asked. Lyria pointed eastward. The final fragment lies in the ruins of Emberroot, deep within the Dragon Spine Forest. An ancient dragon's heart once burned there, and the priest sealed its essence in a gem of living flame. She drew a slender staff of hurricane oak and pressed it to the ground. Follow the storm line through the forests. It will guide you with the storm feather given in the chalice hole. Darren and Rennick began their descent from Stormpeak, guided by the wizard's staff and the currents of wind weaving through the trees. The gale eased as they lowered in elevation, but the air still crackled with residual magic. Darren felt the chalice throb in time with his pulse, and the rune beneath his eye glowed with quiet assurance. For the first time since the chalice found him, he felt its power settled, complete, as though the dragon's soul was at rest within its silver wall. They reached the forest's edge by nightfall, where the tree line began colossal pines, whose trunks glowed faintly with ember shine, and moss that pulsed with residual heat. The air smelled of smoke and resin, and fireflies drifted like sparks from an unseen fort. Rennick unwrapped a piece of salted meat and held it over a small brazier, the flames dancing pink in the gloom. Emberroot Forest, he murmured. They say its trees feed on dragon fire, and its streams run with molten ore. Darren nodded and checked the chalice, its runes shifting gently in the brazier's light. Flames danced across its surface, as though greeting Old King. As Darren and Rennick pressed into the heart of Emberroot Forest, every shadow seemed alive, every breath charged with expectancy. Somewhere ahead lay the final chamber of the dragon's heart, where the last shard awaited. Beyond that, no prophecy told what would happen when the chalice held 5 fragments, and the dragon's essence burned within its core. Allies might rally to their banner, or ancient powers might rise to claim the chalice for themselves. Darren's jaw set as he gazed at the flickering path of ember-lit vines winding into darkness. The final trial beckoned, and with it the fate of King. He slung his satchel heavier at his hip, felt the chalice's power stirring like a coiled serpent, and whispered, "Let's finish this." With Rennick at his side and magic surging through his veins, Darren plunged into the living heart of Emberroot, determined to claim the final shard or be consumed by the dragon's legacy he bore. Darren stepped from the fire-lit clearing and into the living shadows of Emberroot Forest, where towering pines glowed ember-bright in their own veins, and the ground pulsed with residual dragon fire. Rennick followed close behind, torch held high, its flame dancing across bark that hissed and spat embers like injured beasts. Every breath tasted of smoke and molten metal, every rustle hinted at unseen creatures stirred by ancient magic. The forest floor was a shifting tapestry of ember-lit vines that writhed like living serpents, and patches of glowing mushrooms threw sickly yellow light over stones, slick with sap that smelled of brimstone. Darren's runes-swollen eye drank in every flicker of movement, guiding his steps through creeping roots that sought to trip unwary traveler. He felt the chalice heavier than ever at his hip, as though each shard bound within it had grown into a half-alive presence, urging him onward to the dragon's heart. They moved in silence, save for the crackle of sap underfoot and the occasional drip of oozing resin. The deeper they penetrated, the more the air trembled with heat. Waves of distorted air rose from the blackened soil, and the trees hung low as though bent under some invisible weight. Rennick once cursed under his breath when a vine whipped across his leg, leaving a burn that smoked on his cloak. "This place remembers," he muttered, glancing around warily. Darren nodded grimly. Memories of dragon fire run in every root. We're walking through its grave and its birthplace. He adjusted the strap of his satchel where the chalice lay snug against his side. "Stay close. If the forest tests us, we need to stand together." Rennick grunted agreement, eyes darting as shadowy figures flickered just beyond torchlight. After what felt like hours of crawling beneath low canopies and clambering over scalding stones, they reached a stone circle carved into the heart of the forest, where 5 massive trunks converged like pillars supporting an unseen roof of foliage. At the center stood an ancient altar of black granite, its surface etched with swirling drake motifs and runes that pulsed with a faint red glow. Embedded in the altar was the final shard, a bead of pure living flame, no larger than a man's fist, flickering and writhing as though hungry for oxygen. The shard's glow cast trembling shadows across the clearing, and the ambient heat rose so intensely that Darren felt sweat bead on his brow despite the cool night air beyond the circle's reach. He swallowed hard, heart pounding with both excitement and dread. This was it, the final piece to complete the dragon's chalice, the culmination of a quest that had led him from city back alleys to ash fields and storm peaks. Rennick moved to Darren's side, drawing his sword with a soft rap. "Guard me while you take it," he said quietly, eyes surveying the tree line for threats. "The forest will not give up its heart lightly." Darren crouched at the altar's edge, running fingertips across the runic carving. The chalice throbbed against his hip almost painfully, as though recognizing the proximity of its final counterpart. He withdrew the cup and held it before him, wrapped in the flickering half-light. The chalice's runes glowed in welcome, shedding a gentle silver light that danced over the altar's carvings. Darren inhaled, knelt, and set the chalice on the carved plateau. The runic lines on both relics matching and touching like puzzle pieces. He reached forward, hand trembling, and grasped the shard of living flame through the ringing chorus in his mind. As his fingers closed around it, the forest hushed, so completely that Darren heard his own heartbeat echo. Flames licked across his skin, but did not burn, sinking into the gem's core as they rose, wreathed in dancing light. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the chalice leaped with incandescent fury, veins of dragonfire tracing along its silver rim, as the shard clicked into place at the base alongside the storm crystal, the obsidian, the silver fragment, and the red glass. The runes across the chalice flared in sequence, ancient dragon script weaving into living light, then pulsed outward in a wave that rippled across the forest floor. Embers lifted from the ground and whirled around Darren and Rennick like sparks in a furnace, and the air bent with raw magical force. The trunks of the 5 trees surrounding the circle shuddered and deep resonant roar built in the darkness beyond the ring of pillars. Rennick raised his sword ready to defend, but Darren silenced him with a raised hand. He watched as the forest itself responded, branches bowing inward as though paying homage to the chalice. Then the roar crystallized into a single voice, a low ancient timbre that seemed to emanate from every shadow at once. "Bearer of the dragon's chalice," it intoned. "You have reunited the 5 shards and awakened the heart of the dragon within silver confine. Choose now, command the dragon's legacy to reshape the world, or release the power to restore balance between worm and mortal." Darren's chest tightened. The roar reverberated through his bones, and his rune-shaped eye burned with unspoken power. He closed his good eye and concentrated, feeling the chalice's pulse as one heartbeat, one living ember of a dragon's soul. He could sense the world's wounds, the choking of forests under ash, the scars of battles fought with dragonfire, the desperate murmur of cultists seeking to unleash destruction, and he could feel the hunger of the dragon's power, coiled and waiting for release. He lifted the chalice high, so its light glowed like a beacon against the night. "I command the dragon's legacy not as master but as guardian," he declared, voice ringing through the clearing. "I release its power to heal the land, to bind wounds men have inflicted, to protect those who cannot stand against darkness. May its righteous flame burn away corruption, not life. May its thunderous roar awaken hope, not fear." His words rang clear and true, and the chalice pulsed in his palm, its runes weaving a tapestry of silver fire that spread outward. The low roar shifted, softened into a rumble of approval, and the ember shard within the chalice flared, sending a pulse through the fort. Roots receded, embers settled back into sleeping veins, and the choking heat eased as though drawn into the cup's bowels. The 5 trees at the circle's rim glowed softly, buds unfurling along bark that had once been dry and cracked. Tiny shoots of new growth appeared at the base of each trunk, and the mushrooms glowed dim to a gentle bioluminescence. The altar's basin drained, the black granite cool beneath Darren's finger. When the glow subsided, Darren exhaled hard and lowered the chalice, now a seamless vessel of 5 bound shards. Rennick sheathed his sword, face awash with wonder. "You did it," he breathed. "The forest. It's alive again." Darren nodded, feeling exhaustion wash over him. As adrenaline ebbed, "The dragon's legacy rests with those who wield it," he said softly. "We honored that trust. Now we must return the chalice to the world, and ensure it remains safe." Behind them the forest sighed, as if waking from a long nightmare. Branches creaked as they stretched toward a sky now visible through the parting canopy. Stars glimmering anew, no longer obscured by ash and mist. Darren lifted the chalice to his lips and whispered a quiet invocation. "May the dragon's flame guide us, and its silence protect us until we call upon its power again." The cup glowed in acknowledgement, warm to the touch, and its runes shimmered with a final pulsing beat. They turned from the clearing, and made their way back through Emberroot Forest, torches unlit now that the chalice's light sufficed to cut through shadows. The ember-lit vines no longer writhed threateningly, but lay flattened as a safe path behind them. The mushrooms glowed tranquilly, like lanterns illuminating their retreat. Darren and Rennick walked side by side, words unneeded in the face of what they had achieved. Every step felt lighter, as though the chalice's magic was blessing the soil beneath their boots. The next morning they emerged from the forest's edge onto a rolling plain dotted with wildflowers pushing through blackened earth. In the distance the spires of Felshire glinted beneath a dawn sky unmarred by smoke. Darren paused to look back toward Emberroot's dark tree-line, heart swelling with the memory of fire and growth entwined. He closed his eyes and felt the chalice's pulse at his side, a steady, life-breath rhythm. Rennick nudged him. "What now?" he asked, eyes bright with purpose. Darren smiled. The weight of his quest complete, yet the road ahead still open. "Now," he said, "we ensure the chalice's power serves the land. We bring aid to those who suffered under dragon's fire and human cruelty. We forge alliances stronger than steel and vows deeper than magic. And when the world is ready, we will stand watch, warden and sentinel of the dragon's chalice." Rennick clasped Darren's shoulder. "To that, I pledge blade and life." Darren looked at the chalice's runes one last time and whispered, "Then let us go, guardian of the chalice." With that, they set off down the sunrise-lit road toward Felshire, their figures outlined against a world reborn, a world where the heart of a dragon slept once more in silver slumber, awaiting the day its flame would be called upon again. As dawn's first pale light crept over Felshire's rain-slick rooftops, Darren and Rennick descended the battered gates, the morning air crisp with promise and the promise of rain. Their cloaks, once mottled with ash and soot, now carried the faint scent of pine and river mist. Around them the city stirred. Bakers hauling trays of steaming loaves, Fishermen hauling nets, slick with river smelt, and street urchins blinking awake in doorways. Word of their return had spread overnight. By the time they reached the central plaza, a small crowd had gathered: harried merchants, curious blacksmiths, and a few pale scholars from the Tower of Meros, eager for news of the dragon's chalice. Darren glanced at the chalice's sealed casing at his hip and gave Rennick a curt nod. They stepped onto the raised stone dais where an old speaker's post still bore the scars of curious carvings, and the murmurs quieted to reverent hush. Darren cleared his throat, his voice hoarser than he expected given the quiet of his nights in the wilds. "Citizens of Falshur," he began, glancing over the faces lit by the early sun, "I stand before you not as a hero, but as a guardian. The dragon's chalice is whole once more, its shards bound, its power sealed within these walls, so that no tyrant or cultist may unleash draconic fury upon the world." A ripple of relief ran through the crowd, but Darren held up a hand. "Yet the chalice's power is not a tool for war, it is a force of balance. In the months ahead, Rennick and I will travel across the realm, seeking those in need of healing, rebuilding what was broken by dragonfire and human greed alike. We ask for your trust, for your aid in setting right the wrongs inflicted upon your neighbor. But know this, the chalice will remain here, under the watch of Lyria Stormweaver and the Council of Elders, until its next calling, Meros." The bespectacled scholar who had once chased the chalice for his own fame, stepped forward from the scholarly delegation, eyes wide with genuine humility. "I will devote my chronicles to the true history of the dragon's chalice," he stammered, voice thick with emotion. "No longer shall its story be twisted by ambition." Behind him, other citizens, craftsmen, farmers, even a handful of soldiers, stepped forward, pledging food, labor, and watchful eyes to protect the chalice's resting place. Darren's chest tightened with gratitude. Falshur had given him nothing but disdain once, now it offered hope. That evening, the council chamber in the high tower echoed with the measured voices of Falshur's elders, as they formed a guardianship overseen by Lyria Stormweaver and fortified by protective ward. Darren watched from a side balcony as she and Meros deciphered ancient scrolls to inscribe words on silver plates that would seal the chamber. Rennick leaned beside him, dark hair tousled by the breeze. "You did good," Rennick said, quietly, eyes on the scribes below. Darren offered a half smile. "We did good. But there's more to be done." Before they retired for the night, Darren and Rennick gathered their gear in the small guest quarters of the tower. He laid the chalice on the floor between them, its polished silver rim catching torchlight through the chamber's narrow window. "Our first stop," Darren said, counting off on his fingers, "is the Emberford district south of Grey Harbor. Fish farms there were scorched by dragon embers last winter. The villagers lost half their livelihood. We can help rebuild their levees, maybe coax new spawn from the river's heart." Rennick nodded, tracing a finger along a burn scar on Darren's gauntlet, a souvenir from the living flame. "Then we head west, to the Great Marshes, where the swamp people still suffer under the cult's lash. Rumor says they hide survivors of the Ninth Flame's purge." Darren inhaled, eyes steely. "We'll need allies there. The swamp's danger lies not only in the shifting bogs, but in the biting politics of the clans." He turned to Rennick. "But after that, I want to seek out Captain Ivar's cousin Arlo Hawksong, who trades in Skyrie. He owes me one, and he's got contacts in the Iron Coast, places far beyond what any kingdom holds." Rennick threw a salted hunk of meat into a brazier, sparks dancing. "Then we'll find the swamp queens and the coast traders, bind them all into a web that protects the chalice's peace." Night seeped through the windows as they planned, and finally Darren stood and snuffed the braziers, the room falling to soft darkness, broken only by lamp glow. He draped his cloak over his shoulders, and slung his satchel across his chest. "Come sunrise, we ride." Rennick lay back on the cot, rubbing his sword flat across his lap. "Come sunrise," he echoed sleepily. Morning dawned, violet and gold. Darren and Rennick rode out of Falshur beneath the gaze of Lyria Stormweaver, who stood on the gate tower's ramparts. The wizard's eyes glinted with pride and caution. "Go with care," she called. "The chalice's light will guide you, but remember that dark forces still covet its power." Darren inclined his head. "We will not fail." With that, they rode south across fields of green interrupted by ribbon streams, the towering spire of Falshur shrinking behind them. Days passed in a whirl of toil and compassion. In Emberford they labored alongside fishermen to shore up earthen dikes, mixing stone and clay until water seeped no further. Darren set the chalice on a raised wooden pedestal at the levee's crest, and whispered an invocation. A tendril of magic seeped into the soil, binding the river's flow to gentler channels. The villagers watched in awe as water calmed behind the levee, rising only to nourish tilled banks rather than wash them away. Mothers wept as children splashed in the shallows, naming Darren catcher of river. Rennick bartered for new nets and anchors, trading favors with the men who had once eyed him as a hired blade. By twilight, Emberford bloomed anew with green shoots along the levee's brink. From Emberford they traced the marsh's reed-choked paths to the great marshes, where clusters of wooden huts perched atop stilts above fetid waters. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and the foul tang of brackish mud, and tribal banners fluttered from bamboo poles to mark clan boundary. Darren's arrival with Rennick and the chalice turned hostile suspicion into wary curiosity. Small skirmishes of words, then grudging hospitality as the swamp queens, tall women with scales on their forearms, and goggles of smoked glass, tested the chalice of power to purify a tainted well. A single drop of consecrated water from the chalice's rim quelled a bitter stench and turned the muck to fresh water, enough to feed hungry teeth and damp tinder. Clan feuds ebbed as tabled for the first time in years under the promise of shared bounty. With each deed the chalice's legend grew. Dragon's Grace, they called him, and the name spread on wind and whispered rumor. But valley and marsh, sea and mountain, everywhere dark tidings followed. Cultists of the Ninth Flame, cloaked in charred robes, emerged from hidden temples to claim rumors of the chalice's appearance. They struck in the dead of night, sacking village stores for scraps of lore and blood, leaving the wounded to bleed beneath crooked crosses. Darren and Rennick moved like ghosts among the bloodied trenches, one moment healing the dying with waters from the chalice, the next slipping into a cultist encampment to draw them into traps. The second they sensed the chalice's power flaring to shield innocence or ward off curses, they struck. Time and again, Rennick's blade flashed in moonlight as he cut down cultists, while Darren whispered incantations to douse dark glyphs painted on doorways. It became a dance of steel and silver light, a deadly waltz that left the cult's numbers thinned and their leaders frantic. By the time Lady Arya of Skyreach answered their call, sent by Captain Arlo Hawksong on the Iron Coast, Darren and Rennick were hardened into legends. Arya, a tall noblewoman with hair like burnished copper and eyes that measured every move, arrived with 6 galleons of her father's fleet and 100 mercenary archers. She came not to seize the chalice but to pledge her fleet as guardians, believing Darren's promise to protect the realm's balance. At her side stood Arlo Hawksong, smoke-greased and one-eyed like his cousin Avar, who charged them a single golden phoenix feather for the chalice's transport to Skyreach. Darren paid in terms of heartfelt thanks rather than coin, sealing the alliance with a pledge of safe harbor whenever the chalice's weight grew too heavy on the road. With reinforcements at their backs, Darren, Rennick and Lady Arya forged north toward the fjords of Thalasar, where cultists had commandeered ancient sea temples carved into basalt cliffs. The temples were cloaked in mists, the tide rising blood-red at dusk as though the ocean mourned its own desecration. Rennick organized landing parties under the cover of pre-dawn fog while Darren slipped into hidden grottos beneath the temples, chalice in hand, to cleanse the tide pools of dark runes. Each time the chalice's runes glowed with desperate white light, cultists roared and surged forward like rabid wolves. Arya's archers rained arrows tipped with blessed silver into the fog, and Rennick's sword rang against steel in narrow corridors slick with brine. By night's end the temples lay silent, black robes smoldered, and rosettes of moonlight danced across purified waters. But victory carried a price. Arya's fleet had drawn the attention not only of cultists, but of the tide witches, sea sorceresses who commanded currents and drownings. They demanded tribute for safe passage or threatened whirlpools that could swallow 100 ships. Arya, proud and unbowed, refused any bargain. As her ships anchored beneath the swaying masts in Thalasar Bay, she called upon Darren's chalice to calm the raging sea. Hesitant but resolute, Darren stood at the prow of Arlo's flagship beneath a crescent moon, held the chalice aloft and whispered the words he had uttered in Emberroot's heart. A gentle glow spread across the water's surface, tendrils of silvery light weaving between waves, and the tempest stilled as though lulled by a lullaby. The tide witches watched from hidden reefs, their eyes wide with grudging respect, and receded beneath the waves, their curses echoing like dying thunder. When the dawn rose over placid waters, Arya hailed Darren as Dragon's beacon, her voice carried by trumpet and horn across the... But Darren turned away, the weight of the chalice a reminder that his path was not one of glory but of vigilance. Rennie clapped him on the shoulder. "We've done more good in a fortnight than many knights do in a lifetime." Darren nodded, staring at the chalice's sealed runes, and allowed himself a rare moment of pride tempered by caution. "And yet, the cult still lurks. For every temple we free, 10 dark altars rise elsewhere." They set sail again, this time with Arya's fleet in guarded formation behind them, heading toward the desert of Whispering Sands, where rumors spoke of an ancient tomb built by a dragon priest king, whose relics could rival the chalice's power. Darren kept the chalice locked in a warded chest, deep in the ship's hold, its pulse muted by layers of runic seals. Rennick stood watch on deck, ship's lanterns at his side, blade in hand. The sea breeze carried tales of caravans massacred at dusk and ghost riders haunting oasis ruin. Darren felt the rune in his eye drift into dreams of shifting sands, of blazing sun and shadowed corridors. He awoke thirsty for magic and wary of traps laid for those who dared wield draconic power. As they sighted the desert's red dunes at dawn, Darren inhaled the dry air and braced for new trials. Before them lay a shifting sea of sand and the promise of hidden ancient vaults. Arya and Arlo set up a port under the ship's sails to trade spices and fresh water with desert nomads, forging yet another alliance. Darren consulted with tribal sheiks, offering healing waters and forging peace pacts that would keep caravans safe. Rennick mapped out supply lines and defensive positions in case cultists attempted ambushes along well-worn trade routes. When the last caravan departed for distant lands and only the desert winds remained, Darren and Rennick led a small escort into the dunes, Chalice stored in a warded satchel and torches cutting arcs of red light through the night. They found the tomb's entrance behind the crest of a rolling dune, twin stone pillars carved with serpentine dragons, mouths ajar as though warning off intruders. The air hummed with forbidden power, the runic seals on the satchel rattled soft. Darren lit a torch and the flickering flame revealed a yawning stairwell plunging into granite depths. Rennick hefted his sword, no turning back now. Darren exhaled and followed, torch held high, stepping into darkness where only the chalice's quiet heartbeat promised guidance. The world above crumbled behind them, eyes turned toward new horizons, but here in the tomb's shadow only one truth remained. As long as the dragon's chalice lived in mortal hands, its bearer must walk the line between light and darkness, forging hope with every drop of draconic flame and warding off the shadow of greed that ever sought to consume it. With that thought, Darren descended into the tomb's depths, Rennick at his side, and the chalice's heartbeat echoed in the hush of ancient stone, a promise of power and peril entwined in silver and flame. Darren stepped off the final stair and into a vast subterranean hall, where torchlight danced across walls, carved with scenes of dragon priests invoking worm flare beneath bleeding suns. Rennick's sword arm was steady, but sweat beaded at his hairline as he scanned the darkness beyond the flickering cones of light. The air was thick with incense and dust, the scent of crushed obsidian and old parchment. Here, in this dragon priest king's tomb, time had grown deaf and blind. Even the stalwart bones of his guardians had long since crumbled to dust. Yet the runic seals woven around the chalice satchel pulsed in resonance with the glyphs on the walls, as though the tomb itself sensed the bearer's approach. Darren closed his good eye and let the rune in his left shape his vision, tracing the finest spiderweb lines of arcane script that pointed deeper into the chamber. He whispered, "This way," then advanced with deliberate steps, each echo ringing hollow in the vaulted space. Rennick followed, torch raised overhead, casting grotesque shadows that writhed with every breath. They passed through an archway flanked by twin drake statues whose eyes had held garnets once. Now only polished hollows gazed at them. Beneath their carved claws lay depressions, where oil once burned to ward off desecration. Darren struck a flint on the griffin bone handle of his dagger, sparking a brief flare that revealed subtle etchings at the base of each statue. Runes of protection, wards against undead and sorcery. He placed a finger on one chiseled line, felt the rune in his eye resonate, and nodded to Rennick. "The wards here are dormant but intact. We should avoid triggering the glyph floor." The path forward was a mosaic of interlocking stone tiles, each painted with a segment of a fractal dragon's coil. A single misstep could activate poison needles or collapse the corridor behind them. Darren studied the patterns, tracing the central spiral where the dragon's heart would rest, and found the safe thread of unbroken tiles. He stepped precisely, testing each tile's resistance with his boot, until he reached the far side. Rennick followed in his footsteps, breathing quietly. When they both stood beyond the mosaic, the echo of their boots sounded triumphant. Beyond the tiled floor lay a low door carved from volcanic glass, its surface shimmering with heat. Even in the cold tomb, Engraved upon it was an image of a dragon's claw holding a crystal heart of flame. Darren pressed his palm to the center of the carving, and the door hummed as molten glass ran through hidden channels, reshaping the surface until it sank inward, swinging open without a sound. Inside lay a narrow shaft of polished obsidian that slanted steeply downward. At its foot, a pit opened like a gaping maw. From the lip of the pit drifted a faint orange glow, and distant echoes of dripping water or perhaps something more sinister. Rennick braced against the doorframe. Pit, traps, no telling how deep, he breathed. Darren studied the incline and found slender carved steps on one side, worn smooth by countless feet. He held out a handhook fashioned from steel and bone. We'll descend the steps slowly. Keep watch above for any surprises. Rennick nodded, gripping the walls for support as they edged downward, blades ready. At the bottom they found themselves in a circular chamber whose walls curved inward, carved to resemble the inside of a dragon's ribcage. The ceiling soared overhead in a dome of black stone flecked with silver, stars captured in rock. A pool of molten metal glowed in the chamber's center, its surface rippling like liquid fire. Suspended above it by chains of adamantine was a stone plinth bearing an ominous bronze brazier, still hot enough to sear flesh. Behind the plinth, set flush in the wall, was a great cavity shaped like a dragon's heart, an organ chamber where the final relic had rested before being taken by cultists long ago. Now, only an indent remained, glowing with residual heat. Darren felt the rune in his eye flare, as though the chalice recognized its kin. He approached the plinth, mindful of the molten metal that belched wisps of scorching vapor. Rennick stood at the chamber's edge, watching for hidden ambush. Darren bent to examine the brazier's base, and found intricate bronze gears partially visible through small vents. He realized they formed part of a locking mechanism that held the plinth aloft above the metal. With a swift movement, he drew a length of rope from his pack, and wrapped it securely around the plinth's stone column. Hand over hand he began to wind the rope, pulling the brazier downward until its chains slackened and the plinth scraped along stone rails until it settled into the molten pool with a hiss of steam. Sparks flew as bronze met metal, and the brazier's base glowed white-hot. Rennick stepped forward, shield raised against flying embers. Darren wiped sweat from his brow. That should free the cavity, he said, eyeing the heart-shaped niche. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the chalice, its runes glowing with anticipation. He stepped toward the niche, noticing runes carved into the metal floor at his feet, defensive glyphs that would harm anyone who touched the cavity without the chalice's metal rim present. He whispered the chalice's invocation, a single word in draconic tongue, and the cup's rim pulsed with radiant light, extending a silver aura in a circle around the cavity, neutralizing the defensive runes. With protective aura in place, Darren knelt and set the chalice in the heart indentation. The molten metal at the brazier's lip flashed, and heat flared through the chamber as if recognizing the union. He lifted the chalice's bowl toward the cavity and slowly rotated it so the runic patterns along its rim aligned with those etched around the niche. As the final shard hovered above the chalice's rim, a tremor shook the chamber. Darren steadied his balance and lowered the living flame shard into the chalice, watching as it clicked into place alongside the four others. The dragon scale runes along the chalice's rim kindled with multicolored fire: silver, red, black, storm, and living flame, then wove together, forming a single soaring dragon in flight. The dome above them shuddered, and for a moment the molten pool glowed brighter than the sun. Then, with a sound like thunder in the bones of the world, the brazier snapped open, disgorging a wave of liquid metal that rushed toward the chalice. But the cup's aura held firm, and metal flowed around it as though diverted by an unseen current, filling the niche and sealing the chamber's power behind a mirror of solidified bronze. The noise subsided into a low roar, ending with a crashing silence. As the echoes died, Darren rose, chest heaving, and felt the chalice's full power humming in his hand. Rennick approached, blade sheathed, awe in his eyes. "You did it," he said, voice thick. Darren's own voice trembled with relief and reverence. "It's complete." The chalice in his hand was no longer a simple relic, but the vessel of a dragon's essence, a library of draconic might sealed within silver. The runes no longer pulsed. They stood in silent, radiant testament to unity complete. Above them, in the reflected silver of the dome, the image of a dragon coalesced, wings outstretched as though ready to soar once more. Darren raised the chalice high, and every rune flared in silent salute. Rennick circled the chamber, testing the now passive runic floor with his boot. No spark, no jolt. He nodded. "The trap is sealed." Darren set the chalice on the plinth, now cooled and silent, and it settled into place with a gentle click. He sheathed his dagger and offered Rennick a hand. "Come on, we need to prepare for our exit. This place may not remain peaceful for long." Renix clasped his forearm and followed as Darren collected rope and tool. As they retraced their steps, the tomb seemed to exhale around them. Corridors that had felt oppressive now felt expansive, the carved bones of dragons lining the walls no longer threatening, but reverent. Faint blue runes glowed along the arches, a soft farewell spelled in draconic script. Bearer, go forth in worthy heart, the dragon's spirit rests. Darren paused to touch one rune, feeling a warmth spread through his fingertips. He turned to Rennick. We carry more than power now. We carry responsibility for every life saved, every land healed. Rennick ducked under the lowered door and grinned. Then, let's get out before someone realizes what we've done, and comes to take it away. They ascended the obsidian shaft, careful now that the locking pints had shifted, and climbed the steps across the bronze molten hall. Sparks long since cooled littered their path, and the ribcage of stone behind them stood silent sentinel. Each step upward felt lighter than before, as if the chalice's power was lighting their way from below. At the top the glass door parted and they emerged into the salted air of the desert dusk. Outside, the ship's lanterns glimmered like distant stars across the sands, and the dunes stretched translucent beneath a copper sunset. Rennick breathed deep, nothing left but open skies, and the world above. Darren nodded, lifting the chalice from his pack, and cradling it in both hands. Its runes glowed softly, a lullaby of draconic power finally contained. Sand whispered around their boots as they made their way back to the ship. Beyond, the caravan of desert nomads waited to guide them to the nearest port, where Arya's fleet would sail them south toward Foulshore, or wherever the chalice's duty called next. Darren felt the weight of all they had done, every village saved, every cultist thwarted, every alliance forged, and yet he knew the journey was far from over. The world was larger than any map, and Dragon's legacy did not abide by border. In the sway of torchlight on the chalice's rim, he saw his own reflection, eyes determined, heart open, burden and blessing intertwined. He looked at Rennick. What now? Rennick's grin was wry and hopeful. Now we bring the Chalice of Dragons back to where its story began, or perhaps where its next chapter will be written. Darren lifted the chalice overhead, to Foulshore, but afterward, we follow the wind to wherever darkness stirs against the light. Rennick slung a pack over his shoulder. I'd have it no other way. Together they strode across hot sands toward the waiting caravan. Chalice secured in purpose unwavering, the dragon's heart asleep within silver walls, but forever ready to wake at their command. And as the first stars blinked alive above the desert plain, the story of the dragon's chalice turned its page once more. A saga written in fire and steel, mercy and madness, and the unbreakable bond between man and were. Darren rode at dawn through fields streaked with wheat and wildflowers. Rennick at his flank, and the dragon's chalice secured against his chest beneath layers of leather and warded wraps. The caravan of nomads and Skyreach riders trailed behind him like a living wave of color against the greening land. As the spires of Foulshore drifted back into view above buzzing marketplaces and smoke-curled chimneys, Darren felt a weight in his chest not of exhaustion but of anticipation. The world they'd touched, marsh and mountain, desert and sea, lay thrumming beneath the chalice's silent heartbeat, a chorus of voices seeking both mercy and vengeance. He glimpsed Rennick studying the horizon, face drawn with memories of past battles and the promise of those yet to come, and realized that each step toward the city was also a step into new dangers. Cult remnants had regrouped deeper in the wilds. Noble houses whispered of power to be seized, and the secret order of the Obsidian Scale lurked in shadowed chapels. Darren tightened the straps on his gauntlets as the palace walls grew taller and more imposing, determined that he would stand sentinel over the chalice's sanctity while forging alliances sturdier than castle stone. In the council chamber high in Foulshore's western tower, Lyria Stormweaver presided over a gathering of elders, mariners, scholars and Lady Arya of Skyreach, whose copper braid gleamed beneath torchlight. Darren and Rennick entered beneath vaulted arches hung with tapestries depicting dragon priest conquests and mortal rebellion. Maris stood to greet them, ledgers and scrolls clutched in trembling hands, and beside him knelt representatives of merchant guilds and the Fishers' Union, each pledging troops, silver or grain to the new guardianship. As Lyria's silver staff traced sigils of binding around a crystal globe containing the chalice's wards, Bishop Malrek of the Church of the Scaled Dawn watched from a shadowed alcove, lips pursed in contemplative silence. A hush fell when he rose, voice low yet resonant. The chalice of power must serve the light of faith and the edicts of the crown. I propose a sacred oath, sworn by both blade and psalm, binding its use to the church's council. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the chamber. Lady Arya's hand flew to the hilt of her dagger and Rennick's jaw clenched. Durin stepped forward, the chalice's hum thrumming beneath his cloak. Its power answers only the will of guardians chosen by truth and mercy, not by gilded throne or pulpit decree. As Malric's dark gaze met his, Durin felt the chill of unseen daggers drawn, a reminder that even allies could harbor secret blades. By twilight a gala filled the plaza beyond the walls. Lanterns hung like captured stars and street strollers murmured of the ceremony's outcome. Durin stood near the fountain, now draped in silken banners, Chalice at his side, while Rennick mingled with the city watch captain, gathering rumors of cultist stirrings in the old quarter. Beneath the music of lutes and flutes, Durin discerned whispered threats and promises traded behind masks. An assassin in ebony leather slipped past his peripheral vision before ghosting into a side alley. Durin's rune-shaped eye flared, vision widening to track her retreating silhouette. He moved with preternatural silence, Rennick at his heels, and cornered the figure beneath a scaffold of scaffolding and creeping ivy. The assassin's dagger glinted as she turned, only for Durin to catch her wrist in iron-tipped gauntlet. Light from a passing torch illuminated her face, a young woman, eyes wide with terror rather than malice. She spat, voice shaking, "Tell Bishop Malric I serve no man but the order. The chalice is ours by covenant of blood." Before Durin could question her further, she ducked beneath his grip and vanished into the night maze. The threat had a name now, Obsidian Scale, a clandestine order bent on subverting both church and state to claim draconic dominion. The next morning, as the sky bloomed pale rose and gold, Durin convened with Rennick, Lady Arya, and Lyria in a hidden annex beneath the council tower. Maps of the realm, dotted with red markers, lay spread across a stone table. "We've fortified Falshore's wards, but the order strikes through priests and ports alike," Lyria warned, eyes flickering with arcane light. "We need to sever their head before they cripple our alliances." Arya slammed a gauntleted fist on the table, rattling scroll jar. "Their stronghold lies in the ruins of Blackspire's sister fortress across the Iron Coast. My cousin Arlo's network reports shipments of obsidian forged into ritual blades, plain signs of their black rituals." Rennick crossed his arms. "We gather a strike force, knights from Emberford, archers from Skyreach, and a covert team from the Marsh clans. I'll lead the charge." Durin placed the chalice at the map's center. "And I'll go with you, but only as guardian of its power. The chalice cannot fall into enemy hands, not now when it binds the land together." They sealed the pact with a silent nod, the chalice's runes pulsing in affirmation. That afternoon, under heavy rain, Durin scoured Falshore's lower quarter, seeking intelligence from gamblers' dens and back-alley informants. The city gorged on casks of ale, yet fear and greed flickered behind drunkards' eyes as they glimpsed Durin's rune glow in tavern mirror. He exchanged coin for whispers, learning that Bishop Malric had dispatched emissaries to Blackspire's ruins under cover of night, their aim to retrieve a shattered fragment of draconic bone rumored to lie beneath the fortress's southern keep. If they reunited that bone with the chalice's shards, they could command beasts of wing and scale to raise kingdoms. Durin's heart thundered. He summoned Rennick at once. "We ride tonight. If the order retrieves that fragment, the world will drown in dragon fire." Rennick drew his blade from its scabbard. "Then we'll bury them instead." At dusk they assembled under Falshore's moonlit walls, 100 warriors clad in leather and mail, banners of Emberford and Skyreach blending in the mist. Lyria stood at the head, staff ablaze with soft light, chanting wards to conceal their passage. Lady Arya's galleon-born archers flanked the vanguard, bows strung with silver sinew. Rennick's marsh champions lurked in the flanks, silent as reeds in water. Durin cradled the chalice beneath his cloak, feeling its warmth like a heartbeat against his ribs. The ground trembled as they crossed the river bridge, torches bobbing in silent ranks. Ahead lay the ruins, broken towers half swallowed by bramble, ash-stained walls still humming with old dragon sorcery. As they approached the shattered gatehouse, a war horn's cry echoed from within. Durin's rune flared, Rennick's sword gleamed. The battle for the dragon's chalice and for the soul of the realm had just begun. Durin led the charge through the ruined gatehouse without a single backward glance. Chalice secured beneath his cloak and Rennick at his shoulder. Behind them, Emberford knights and Skyreach archers moved like shadows, blades drawn and bows bent, ready for the black-robed figures waiting in the courtyard. Rain fell in icy sheets that turned the ash-stained cobbles into slick traps, but no water nor mud could slow their purpose. A warhorn's cry rose over the thunder as cultists of the obsidian scale surged from crumbling archways, obsidian blades catching torchlight in jagged flashes. Durin's rune-shaped eye glowed silver through the gloom, guiding his steps as he vaulted over a broken fountain and into the melee. Rennick met him midway, steel ringing against steel, and together they cut a path toward the southern keep where Bishop Malrek and his acolytes performed their dark rite. Every swing of Durin's dagger was precise, born of years of dangerous quests. Every thrust from Rennick's sword was unerringly aimed, tempered by honor. Around them knights roared as they broke cultist lines, archers loosed volley upon volley, and the temple columns shuddered beneath the onslaught. Within moments they reached the ruined stair that led to the chapel's upper chamber. Torches winked at irregular intervals, casting long trembling shadows against burnt tapestries and fractured icons. Through the door they heard the low drone of chanting, Malrek's deep voice weaving prayer with unholy invocation. Durin drew the chalice from its warded wraps and placed a hand on the hilt of his dagger. Rennick raised a gauntleted fist in wordless solidarity. They pushed open the door together, blades at ready, and strobes of lightning from the storm outside illuminated the scene. Bishop Malrek in ornate vestments, his cassock scorched where draconic glyphs had burned into flesh, stood before a stone altar carved in the shape of a dragon's maw. 5 cultist acolytes knelt around him, each holding a blackened shard of draconic bone. At the center of the altar lay the battered fragment of lung white as ivory and cracked with ancient fire magic. Malrek's outstretched hand called upon winds that howled through broken windows, and flickers of specter fire danced around the cultists' prostrate forms. Durin stepped forward onto the cracked marble floor, the chalice's rim glowing faintly against his palm. "Bishop," he called, voice firm despite the roar of wind and steel. "Your covenant holds no sway over the dragon's chalice. Its power answers to no counsel, but truth and mercy." Malrek's head snapped up, eyes aflame with fanatic conviction. "Fool," he spat, voice echoing off stone. "You know nothing of divine right. We serve the higher purpose of draconic rebirth. Through the chalice and the bone, the dragon's spirit shall rise in heaven and earth alike." He lifted the lung fragment toward the storm-torn sky, and a bolt of lightning split the roof above, casting the hall in searing white light. The chalice's runes flared in response, bathing the room in a wash of silver fire. Durin clenched his jaw and advanced 2 paces, chalice raised like a shield. "I serve the living world, not some dead god of ash and ruin." With lightning-fast motion, Rennick charged the nearest acolyte, cleaving through black robes with a blow that crackled with righteous fury. Steel met steel, as Durin turned his attention to Malrek's golden censer, raining enchanted incense that whispered of decay. He hurled it aside with a swift kick, and the ash dust cloud dissipated in the purifying glow of the chalice. Malrek snarled and hurled a wave of eldritch energy, but the chalice's aura shimmered and absorbed the blast, sending only a tremor of force back into bishop and altar. Durin sprang forward but was intercepted by 2 acolytes brandishing curved daggers. He swiveled, sealing the chalice in his left hand and drawing his dagger in the right. A spinning strike caught one acolyte's blade at the forearm, sending him stumbling into the other, who caught Durin's pommel with his dagger and spun him off balance. Durin's gloved hand clenched the chalice's stem and slammed it into the priest's jaw, ringing bone and scattering teeth across the marble. The acolyte slumped unconscious as Rennick dispatched the other with a clean stroke. Bishop Malrek descended the altar steps to meet Durin, face drawn in feverish triumph. Around them the cultists rose, brandishing bone shards with wild fervor. Durin tightened his grip on the chalice, feeling the 5 shards within him like a living heart. Malrek pointed at the chalice and hissed, "You have stolen my right, I will claim it now." He thrust his hand toward the cup, summoning a vortex of black flame that swirled around his gauntlet. Durin held the chalice high, runes gleaming silver against the dark. The 2 magics collided in midair, black flame on one side, silver fire on the other, and the chapel trembled under the force. Durin gritted his teeth, will reforged by every trial they had endured. He spoke a single word in draconic tongue, low and resonant, and the chalice pulsed, releasing a shockwave of pure restoring magic that blasted through bone and stump. Malrek screamed as the black flame was inverted by the chalice's power, scorching his robes from the inside out, and leaving him writhing on the altar fringe. Rennick charged the fallen bishop, blade ignited with anticipation, but Durin held him back with an outstretched arm. "No," he said, voice echoing, "we do not kill those who yield, even when they have done wrong." Malrek's convulsions ceased as the chalice's light washed over him, cleansing corruption from flesh and spirit both. He lay still, tears streaming down his cheek. The storm outside abated to a rumble as though approving mercy over vengeance. At Durin's gentle nod, Rennick lowered his sword. Durin knelt beside Malrek, placing the chalice's bowl against the bishop's lip. A single drop of dragonfire promethium leaked forth, scorching the back of Durin's gloved hand, and Malrek's breathing steadied. When he opened his eyes, they were clear rather than fanatical. I have been blind, he whispered, voice trembling. Your mercy has shown me the true covenant. With the battle ended, the surviving cultists surrendered under guard, shackles clinking as knights bound them for transport to the Emberford fortress. Outside the chapel, the storm broke in crimson dusk, sky alight with the first embers of sunset rather than ruinous lightning. Darren stepped onto the steps, Chalice cradled respectfully, and surveyed the assembled knights, archers and marsh champions. As one they lowered weapons in salute. Lady Arya approached, cloak sodden but eyes bright. You have saved us all from a fate worse than death, she said, voice firm yet grateful. Rennick seized his sword and clasped Darren's shoulder. That was one hell of an encore. Darren allowed himself a short smile. Let's go home. The journey back to Falshore was triumphant, banners flying and songs of victory carried on the wind. Wherever the Chalice passed, rivers sparkled clearer, crops seemed to reach skyward in new growth, and children pressed flowers into traveling knights' gauntlet. At the city gates, Lyria Stormweaver awaited on the ramparts, staff uplifted in blessing. Mara stood beside her, scrolls spilling from his arms, eager to record the final chapter. As Darren and Rennick dismounted, they felt the Chalice's final hum, a quiet lullaby that signaled the end of its immediate awakening and the beginning of its legacy. In the council chamber one last time, Darren presented Bishop Malric, now robed in simple vestments of penance, and offered him the chance to redeem his vows by serving as spiritual guardian to the Chalice's custodians. Malric bowed deeply, eyes downcast but determined. I will spend my life ensuring its power serves the living and the just, he vowed. The council elders placed their hands upon the Chalice's case, inscribing new wards and pledging joint oversight by crown, church and chosen guardian. A final ritual of binding sealed the Chalice within crystalline seals that would only yield to the voice of its true bearer. As the chamber doors closed, Darren and Rennick stood alone beneath the vaulted ceiling, the Chalice's soft glow visible through its sealed case. Rennick exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief. It's done. Darren looked at the vessel that had defined his fate for so long. 5 dragon shards united in silver, a power tempered by trials of fire and mercy. It is never truly done, he said softly. There will always be darkness seeking to unbalance the world, but for now, we rest. Rennick drew a water skin and handed it to Darren. To rest then, for as long as we can spare. They shared a relieved laugh. That evening, Falshore held a grand feast in the plaza beneath a sky washed clean of storm clouds. Lanterns floated on river currents, carrying wishes for peace. Darren and Rennick sat together at the dais, Chalice's case placed behind them on a dais of polished oak. Citizens danced in swirling colors. Minstrels sang of hallowed deeds, and for the first time in months, the city breathed easy. Lyria joined them with 2 cups of spiced wine. She raised her goblet, to guardians of the dragon's chalice. She toasted, may your hearts remain true, and your purpose unwavering. They clinked cups, the silver laughter of shared relief echoing through the night air. As the revelry continued, Darren slipped away to the river's edge, Rennick following more slowly. The current glowed silver beneath lantern light, a soft pulse in tune with the Chalice's final blessing. Darren knelt, cupped water in his palm, and whispered a quiet farewell. Thank you, Dragon's Heart, for guiding me. He released the water, watching it spill back into the river. The rune in his left eye dimmed to a soft glow, a reminder of the pact he had sworn with power both ancient and alive. Rennick settled beside him, gazing at the same reflection of lantern light. After a moment, Rennick spoke. What now, Guardian? Darren stood and stretched, shoulders easy. Now, he said, voice resolved. We keep watch. We ride where injustice festers, heal where scars run deep, and stand ready when the Chalice's heart calls us again. Rennick rose as well, sword at his side, silhouette strong beneath the stars. Then let the world be glad it birthed men like us. Together they walked back toward the city's warm glow, past canal bridges and lanterned archways, toward a future shaped by dragon's fire and human compassion. Behind them, the dragon's chalice slept in its warded case, silent guard over the realm's fragile peace. And as Falshore's bells tolled midnight, marking an end and a beginning, Darren and Rennick vanished into the tapestry of lantern light and shadow, the first stewards of a legacy born of shard steel and mercy, a legacy that would endure as long as dragon's flame shone within silver walled